Elise Winters, and I want to welcome you to Kaleidoscopes. Starting your young child on violin is a really exciting thing, and the purpose of this video is really to empower you to make that experience rewarding and enjoyable for you and your child. We'll talk a little bit about ways that you can be most effective as a practice parent. We'll also talk about how to get the most out of every lesson, and we'll talk about what kinds of things you can expect as you're working with that child and how to make that experience as positive as possible. As you begin the process of playing violin, there's a little bit of a paradox because we think of making music as something that's really enjoyable and fun and creative and all of these wonderful things. And the process of practicing is not necessarily enjoyable and creative and all of those things. A lot of times the process of practicing can be boring, it can be lonely, it requires a lot of physical effort. For your young child, there might be some physical discomfort, a sense of physical fatigue that maybe they weren't expecting. And so as you're kind of preparing your child for what this experience is going to be like, you want to listen to how you're languaging that with them, because we want to create a sense of enthusiasm and really looking forward to the process, but we also want to prepare them for the hard work aspect of lessons. We want to instill kind of the value that this is going to be a process that takes discipline, it takes patience. They may not be comfortable all the time that they're playing. There might be some funny noises that come out of their violin, and that sense of struggle and that sense of hard work is an okay part of the process. And if you prepare them for that in advance, and if you kind of communicate with them along the way, they're going to be a lot more able to tolerate that process of working hard in the practice room. And if they're feeling some physical fatigue, they're not going to think of that as a breakdown, like my mom told me that this would be fun and this isn't fun right now. But because you've prepared them for what some of those things are going to be, they have a sense of trust in the process and they have a sense of trust in you, and they don't have an unrealistic expectation that it's going to be fun all the time. Now, the flip side of that is that we want to make sure that the home practice experience and the lessons are as enjoyable and rewarding and fun as we possibly can make them. Because your young child doesn't have available to them the concept of, working really hard and then getting X result. They haven't necessarily lived long enough to have a personal experience of working hard for X number of years and then getting X result. So that kind of long-term sort of goal-oriented thinking isn't part of their vocabulary yet, and it's not even necessarily part of their mental ability to do that yet. So part of our job as the home practice parent or as the teacher is to make sure that that present moment is as an enjoyable and rewarding and engaging and fun as it possibly can be, so that even though we've prepared them that this is going to be hard work, that they're not necessarily feeling that most of the time. Violin is an incredible instrument, and even though I hear violin all day, every day as a teacher, even now if I'm listening to a movie, sometimes I'll hear a violin solo in the background and it completely takes me by surprise how absolutely beautiful it is. So I love what I do. I love the process of teaching young children, but part of what's really there for me about what makes that rewarding is all of the things besides actually getting to play violin that those children are learning from the experience. So I want to talk about some of the skill areas that are developed in young children over the course of their violin study, and those skill areas are also some of the challenges that you're going to find along the way. Shinichi Suzuki referred to his method of teaching violin as talent education. And what he meant by that was that his mission was not really to create a generation of musicians or a generation of violinists, but rather what he was out to do with the people that he was working with was to develop aspects of their character, such as compassion, sensitivity, patience, discipline, an ability to be self-reflective, an ability to collaborate with others, and an ability to kind of push through difficulty and see something through to the end. And those kinds of character traits are something that's going to stay with the child and that they're going to bring to every single area of their life. They're going to bring that to their academics, they're going to bring it to their work, they're going to bring it to when they're raising a family themselves. So what we're doing is we're training the child on the violin, is we're not just training them to move their fingers, but rather we're really building their entire character. the most important things that your child is going to get out of studying violin is what we call metacognitive skills, which basically means learning how to learn or figuring out how to use their own brain. So what that looks like in the violin process is observing their teacher and figuring out how their teacher is making the sounds that they're making, and then analyzing their own playing and figuring out what they're doing differently that is leading to a different result, and then figuring out how to get from point A to point B. Now, as the parent, you're going to be helping them in that figuring out process, but over time, they're going to take on more and more of that. They're also going to be doing things like assessing whether or not they've learned something. Like, for example, maybe they've gotten it right one time and they don't yet know that that doesn't mean that they're going to be able to get it right tomorrow. They naively think that if they get it right once, they've got it. But of course, we know that in order to have it tomorrow, you need to be able to do it many times correctly. So helping them learn how to assess their own learning process. Another of the executive skills that they'll be developing as they learn violin is the ability to manage their own internal state. So, for example, this includes being able to manage their focus, to focus on what they choose to focus on and bracket whatever those distractions are for a certain period of time. Now, if they start violin at the age of, say, 4 or 5, initially their attention span may be 15 minutes, 20 minutes. As they continue to practice that process of focusing, they're going to be able to extend that time span to 30 minutes, to 45 minutes, to an hour, so that by the time they're 8 or 9 years old, an hour is not actually a very long time for them to sustain focus, because they've gradually accumulated a kind of mental stamina. Part of achieving excellence on the violin is being able to simultaneously hold two things in your mind. One is the model of how you want to sound, and then the other is how you currently sound, and being able to hold those two against each other and find where that gap is. So for a young child, or really for any of us, it's very easy to become accustomed to how we sound now and begin to take that for granted. And so we have to constantly keep ourselves on that scale of some standard of playing that is outside of ourselves, which is one of the reasons it's really important to have listening models in the child's life on a daily basis, and to go to concerts where they can really breathe the air of another violinist and hear that high level of playing in a really vivid way. The kind of thinking that we're encouraging is a step beyond simply critical thinking, which would be like, what was wrong with what I just did, or were there any mistakes in what I just did? We're really asking them to think at a whole other level, which is, what I just did was however it was, but what would take it to the next higher level, and to be constantly seeking after that standard. And that standard of excellence is something that they're going to carry with them into every area of their life. Another executive skill that we'll be developing as the child learns violin is their ability to discriminate different stages in the physical learning process. For example, as they first tackle a new skill, their movements are going to be more conscious. It's going to require a lot of mental effort for them to get their body to do what they want it to do. The movements will be rougher and more approximate. As they get more comfortable with that skill, their movements are going to become more efficient and precise. And then finally, in the final stage, their movements are going to be graceful and fluid and comfortable, and it's going to require very little mental effort for them to perform those movements. And at that stage, they can begin to layer other movements on top, because those movements are really becoming very automatic for them. So part of what the child is getting is a sense of what that mastery process looks like, and when they begin to tackle a new skill, they know that it's not enough to simply be able to execute that movement, but rather that they need to hang with that process until that movement becomes natural and graceful and fluid in their body. One of my teachers referred to violin playing as a sport of the small muscles, and if you think about it, it is a tremendously athletic activity, even though we don't think of it that way because it's also music making. If you want to get some sense of the amount of coordination that's involved in playing violin, imagine painting a picture with one hand and typing with the other hand. Now, sometimes the movements in playing violin happen simultaneously, and that's not so bad, but also in some instances, you have to prepare a movement in one hand while simultaneously completing a previous movement in the other hand. So playing violin requires a tremendous amount of body awareness and movement planning. Because we're standing when we perform violin, we have to think of the movements the way a dancer would think about moving. Our movements have to reflect and embody the mood and the expression of the music. Along with that, we have to match the flexibility and firmness of our bow grip to the exact color of sound that we want to create. And we have to match the weight and speed of the bow to the color of the sound that we want to make. So all of this requires a tremendous sensitivity and specificity in the way that we move our body. Playing the violin also requires the child to think spatially. There's a lot of angles involved in playing the violin. The violin is going to be placed at a slight angle to the body, not all the way to the left, but also not allowing it to come into the front. And then the bow, of course, has to be at a perpendicular angle to the violin strings, but looking at the strings, this actually doesn't look perpendicular to the child, so they have to figure out what straight looks like from this very odd vantage point of looking down on the bow. And then, of course, we're not going to leave the bow resting in one place on the string. We have to move it from the frog to the tip, and that involves changing the angle of the wrist and the arm to maintain that straight path. The math that would explain all of these different angle relationships is something the child is not going to learn until pre-calculus at least, but learning all these angles and learning to manipulate their body in this way requires a really rigorous level of thinking. Finally, it isn't enough to just execute the technical aspects of playing the violin. This process is ultimately about communicating something emotionally. And so the child needs to have that technical mastery, but at the same time be able to communicate something emotionally. A child who is more left-brained is going to be really challenged by connecting imaginatively to the music and coming from that more imaginative, creative space while they play. Whereas a child who is already very right-brained and imaginative is going to be challenged to approach playing from an analytical point of view. So no matter who your child is and what their strengths are, playing violin is going to challenge them to develop the other side. So from cognitive skills to spatial skills to movement awareness and planning to emotional expression and creativity, when you work with your child at home, you're helping them to develop a set of mental skills that they will use to excel in a number of disciplines in addition to violin.